I've been a fan of the Scott Pilgrim franchise since the film came out in 2010. It's one of my favorites. I love the game, I love the comic, and I like some of Lil Uzi's music, so when I heard that there was an anime coming out, I was super excited. The trailers made it seem like it was going to be the stuff dreams are made of for a lot of comic book and animation fans out there. A one-to-one, faithful adaptation of the original story. Something the movie couldn't be because of time constraints. Unless you were following the limited press that was out there for the show before its release, you would have had no idea that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was a complete reimagining of the story. In an interview with Cosmopolitan, the creator of the series, Brian O'Malley, said that he felt like he had to warn fans during Comic-Con that the show was going to be completely different so they didn't have a heart attack when they were watching it. Well, I missed that message and caught some serious whiplash during episode 1 because I thought I knew what was coming. For anyone that's only seen the movie, the comic shows a lot more of Scott and Knives' relationship early on. We see how they meet, they go on more dates. It does a much better job at showing you how big of an asshole Scott is for using this 17-year-old girl to boost his ego an entire year after a painful breakup, when he shouldn't be involved with her in the first place. There's more time spent between them, things go way too far, and it makes him cheating on her with Ramona feel way worse. None of this is in the show, and it actually adapts a lot less of the story than the movie does, but it didn't really hit me that there were so many changes until the scene at the rocket. There was no crash, or a single one of his boys anywhere in sight.
Is that girl a boy too?
Yes.
Now this is where I started to get confused, but the fight scene with Matthew Patel plays out basically the same way as in the film, until Scott Pilgrim dies. I have to admit, this bait and switch kind of soured my experience of the show at first, because I had these expectations that were built up because of the trailers. They were very careful in making sure that they only showed scenes that people would recognize from the movie. It felt kind of like somebody offering me a cheeseburger at a barbecue just for me to find out it was vegan after I started eating it. I've had vegan burgers that were delicious, but if I was expecting beef, I would have been upset after biting into it and finding out that it was just a damn mushroom. It's a very natural reaction to be off-put by this, especially if you were going in with the expectation of seeing more of the slice-of-life elements from the comic, or characters like Lisa and Knives' dad who didn't make it into Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I'm definitely not the type of person who hates change, and I love a good twist, but when the twist is shelving the main character, I start to feel kind of iffy about things. I know the show is called Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, but this title is a little bit too vague for it to really be a clue that he just disappears for basically 5 whole episodes. Because of this, I wasn't really into episode 2 as much as I would have been if I already knew that Scott wasn't going to be the protagonist. That being said, I came around to it really quickly because the show kicks all kinds of ass and is beautifully animated. I can understand people being completely turned off by the changes, but Scott Pilgrim Takes Off really is a treat for existing fans of the franchise. It's been almost 20 years since the comics released and 13 since the movie. We've already gotten 3 versions of Scott's story, and O'Malley never had any intention of doing a word-for-word remake in the first place. He said he thought it would be really boring to do this, and to an extent, I kind of agree. This new story might have its flaws, but it's something that I really appreciate because it fleshes out a lot of the characters who might have been one note or deserving of more development. However, the trade-off is we lose the slow growth of Scott's character after he gets kidnapped, and it gets shoehorned into the last 2 episodes because of time constraints again. And this one deviation adds a whodunit mystery element that wasn't present in the movie or the comic. It also changes the trajectory of the lives of every single character in the show. Even still, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off remains a story that uses its characters to explore the themes of relationships, forgiveness, and personal growth.
What are you doing? Getting a life.
Out of everyone, Ramona comes out on top when it comes to improvements. Instead of being a slightly elevated damsel in distress who's fought over, she's the hero that's doing the fighting. That's right, fellas, you are the prize in this story. Scott and Ramona are 2 flawed individuals whose selfish actions leave a trail of hurt people behind them. Instead of them having the difficult conversations and breaking things off with their significant others, they just do what's best for themselves and cheat, or ghost, not caring about the other person's feelings. One of the most important parts of their story is that they earn their relationship with one another by acknowledging their mistakes and confronting their past. Scott does this by reconciling with all of his exes directly, and he helps Ramona do this by fighting hers while she basically goes, okay, what I did was wrong, but I'm going to do better. The thing I like the most about her character arc in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is that through her want to find Scott for a chance to be with him, she ends up doing her own reconciling, giving her exes closure, and allowing them to free themselves from their bitterness over how things ended. I've read a lot of people say they don't understand why Ramona does everything she does to find Scott, considering she only knows him for about a week before he goes missing. Personally, I don't think she really does anything that crazy, and you have to remember that Ramona is literally the only person who knows he's still alive after she hears him in subspace. He technically goes missing because of her, so it's only right that she confronts the League of her evil exes, asking whether or not they had anything to do with his disappearance. Was she supposed to just let him die or stay missing? All she ends up doing anyway is becoming a better person in the process. The only fight she gets into that's directly caused by all of this is with older Scott at the very end of the show. As far as her ending goes, by the way, I'm not the biggest fan of the whole Super Ramona thing. I do like the idea of her getting to the end of her journey and choosing to have done everything she has up to that point for her own sake, like Scott does in the movie.
I want to fight you for me.
But it feels kind of cheapened because there's still a version of that same Ramona at the end who doesn't also make that choice. She says she's tired of running away from her problems, fuses with her future self, which kind of means they're both running away, then tells Scott to tell her that somehow still exists in his timeline to help her not run away from her problems. It's not something that I have the biggest issue with, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense, but I do like what it means symbolically. By far though, the best addition as far as she's concerned is how we're actually shown details of her past rather than just being told them in passing in a conversation. It's cool to see why all of her exes were inspired to join the League in the first place. What surprised me even more than Scott taking off were the changes made to the exes. With Scott seemingly defeated, they had to do something other than just wait around for their turn to fight over Ramona. Giving them closure and actual character arcs is one of the things I would say is a big improvement over the comic. For starters, Matthew Patel and Lucas Lee actually get a chance to exist instead of just showing up, doing something funny, and dying after a few pages. Those two feel the most like video game bosses because originally, all they really get is one conversation and one fight before Scott defeats them. Matthew Patel goes from being the weakest in the league to the strongest after he defeats Gideon and takes over, and he eventually fulfills his dream of becoming an actor. This Lucas Lee is probably the best iteration of the character we've gotten. He's an even better version of Chris Evans' portrayal in the film.
That's actually hilarious.
His episode is probably one of my favorites, not only because of the action and skating scenes, but because it shows that Ramona cheating on him made him way more than just angry. He feels so inadequate that he dedicates his life to becoming a world-famous actor that everyone would want. Him losing it all because of his unbearable personality and then finding validation and becoming besties with Gideon and a new purpose in his job as a barista is the hilarious icing on the cake. Roxy, Todd, and Gideon aren't really lacking for time as far as the comic goes like Matthew and Lucas are. In my opinion, their changes are just fun additions mostly. Because Lisa isn't in the show as a reason for Roxy to seek out Ramona, and Knives' dad isn't there to fight her, her episode is dedicated to giving us a more intimate look at her relationship with her ex. Her feelings about how Ramona treated her aren't just glazed over, and their fight scene was sick as hell too. One of the biggest similarities that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off has with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is that the Katayanagi twins have almost no screen time. The fact that Robot 01 and Neil have more to do in the story than they do is actually really funny, but I do like their new roles along with how Knives is revamped as well. She deserves better than the treatment she gets from Scott, and her actually getting an identity that has nothing to do with trying to win him back is the best thing that could have been done for her character. Grouping her with Steven and Kim was a great choice, and since her and all of the other exes are on a new path, I hope Gideon and Julie being set up as villains at the end pays off and we get a season 2. The handling of Scott Pilgrim's character is really interesting in the retelling. This takes place in a world where the continuation of the story of Scott and Ramona includes them having a happy 10-year marriage that ultimately falls apart because the two of them aren't good at communicating with each other, kind of like how they were when they got together. Ramona says she needs space without clearly defining what that means, and Scott catastrophizes, childishly assuming that she wants a divorce without asking her. And just like she predicted years before,
just another evil ex waiting to happen.
He becomes her ultimate evil ex, a literal self-sabotaging version of himself that selfishly thinks he's doing what's best for him. Seeing how toxic and afraid of being hurt older Scott is, despite all of the good he's experienced in his life with Ramona, is what causes young Scott to want to better himself. I'm most curious to see how his future changes because he kind of gets the easy way out here. Even though he does apologize to Knives, it feels kind of half-hearted, and he still has to settle things with his other exes, Envy and Kim.
I'm sorry about me.
Science Saru, mostly known for dropping the best anime of 2018, could not have done a better job on this show. I have no complaints about any aspect of their work here, and I was really trying to find some criticism worth mentioning and could not find it. The team that worked on this show perfected the feel Brian O'Malley intended Scott Pilgrim to have, and for the most part, they had creative freedom. Their updated character designs enhanced the originals that coincidentally were inspired by manga without going too far and making anyone unrecognizable or looking too anime. Their use of film grain is a great touch. It tones the vibrance of the visuals down just slightly enough to make the show look like a comic book's pages were coming to life. It also adds a nostalgic atmosphere and deepens the moods that are conveyed through their uses of color and effects. Old school Academy ratio is used to establish when we're getting a look into the memories of a character. Pink backgrounds and flickering sparks are often used together to symbolize budding romances and passion. Deep reds consume the screen when villains are present and plotting. The film grain amplifies the impact that all of these elements have. Speaking of the color red, it's also paired with shades of blue to represent the good versus evil dichotomy, and as a nod to the usual Player 1 and Player 2 colors found in multiplayer games. Scott Pilgrim has always been inspired by video games, and the show is stuffed full of references. Each title screen is inspired by classics like Super Mario Bros., Pac-Man, or Mega Man. In all of the text throughout the show, the letter A is always replaced by the Triforce from Legend of Zelda, and all of the versus screens are directly inspired by fighting games. Scott Pilgrim flexes fluid animation, especially during the action. The fight scenes are so creative and a lot of fun to watch. They match the balance of realism and surrealism that Scott Pilgrim has always played with, by including both hand-to-hand choreography and absolute insanity like fireballs, skateboard drill kicks, and transformations. The show was scored by a band named Anama Noguchi, who are responsible for the video game's OST, and a composer named Joseph Trapanese. They used the digital, electronic sounds found in 8-bit pop music, as well as more traditional instruments to create a really fitting soundtrack that helps liven each scene. It's bright and bubbly when Scott first meets Ramona, has dark sinister tones when we're introduced to the League of Evil Exes, and it has mysterious notes when Ramona is looking for answers about what happened to Scott. One of my favorite tracks is called "And They Were Roommates."
We were college roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Mostly because of this reference. Ramona tries to minimize her relationship with Roxy to just being a phase she had with her roommate so she can free herself from the guilt of having left her with no explanation. While Ramona acts like everything is okay because she's okay with it, Roxy is left feeling invalidated, like she meant nothing to her the whole time they were together. The song playing in the background uses piano at a slower tempo, which is automatically sad music to match the tone of the sorrow-filled, dreamlike memory of Ramona ghosting Roxy, and it makes for a pretty heavy scene.
So you left without a word? You made me feel like nothing!
Unfortunately, at the same time, this scene also kind of suffers because the timing of the dialogue feels a bit unnatural.
I'm sorry.
This is one of the few problems that I actually do have with the show. For the most part, I think the performances from the cast are really good at bringing these characters to life. There's no way that everyone in this star-studded cast was going to be available to record their lines at the same time, so even though group recording sessions usually give the best results, I doubt they were ever an option. The biggest disadvantage that solo recording has in comparison is that the actors aren't responding to one another in real time. They can't play off each other's energy or performances. It's up to the directors to have the actors record their lines in different ways over several takes, so they can piece the dialogue together in a way that makes it feel like this isn't the case. Most of the time in animation, you can hardly tell the difference, but in Scott Pilgrim, it definitely sounds like everyone was in a booth by themselves and not talking directly to each other, which sucks because, again, I think the performances were good. They all did a table read over a Zoom call during the pandemic, and it has much better timing even with the delay. While Scott Pilgrim Takes Off can be enjoyed by anyone, regardless of their level of interest in or awareness of the series as a whole, I think it's best appreciated by pre-existing fans. Given the fact that the show was advertised as being a faithful adaptation to the comic, I can understand why some people might not be into the whole bait and switch aspect of the show. Maybe there was a fear that marketing it as the retelling it is would damage the potential viewership. Personally, I would have been just as hyped to watch a show called Ramona Flowers vs. the Universe, or something a lot more creative than what I can come up with. But anyway, this retelling of Scott Pilgrim is like DLC. It's more of the same things you know and love, except we get some extras that we didn't have before. Mostly things dealing with Ramona and her past, which were largely a mystery before now. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off breathes new life into the series with its visual update and reimagined story. However, the main theme is the same as it's always been. Even though you might be an asshole, it's never too late to become a better person. As far as I've seen, the show has had a mostly positive reception, but I have also read some negative reviews. On my first watch, I thought it was just okay, but the second time around, I enjoyed it a lot more. I'm curious to know what you all think, so let me know in the comments and we can discuss there. Thanks for watching. Peace.